Tonight on the Daily Debrief.
She was Amani.
A prosecutor's forceful closing argument.
This defendant starved her to death.
It's the case of a dead child and a stepmother on trial presenting no defense.
The evilness in the world in this case stops today.
Plus, they say she was waiting for a date with Ashton Kutcher when she was stabbed to death. The man suspected is heading for trial as friends discuss their long wait for justice. Also, a judge keeps tapes from that massage parlor where Robert Kraft is accused of receiving sexual favors hidden from public for now. This is the Daily Debrief. It's Monday, April 29th.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Debrief. Michael Bryan is brave enough to face me in the same room today. Katie Kerchasky will be with me in just a moment here. A Georgia woman representing herself without a lawyer presented no defense whatsoever on charges she starved her own stepdaughter to death. Today, she learned her fate. Tiffany Moss refused to give an opening statement, refused to cross-examine witnesses, and refused to give a closing argument on charges she killed 10-year-old Imani Moss. Tiffany is facing the death penalty as we speak. Here was the verdict, though, in the first phase of this trial, a clean sweep for the state.
Verdict, count 1, murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder. Count 2, felony murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of felony murder. Count 3, felony murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of felony murder. Count 4, cruelty to children in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of cruelty to children first degree. Count 5, cruelty to children first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of cruelty to children first degree. Count 6, concealing the death of another. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of concealing the death of another. Signed and dated by the foreperson.
Moss remained silent during her trial, but prosecutors did not hold back during closing arguments today.
The victim weighed 32 pounds. 32 pounds when she was pulled out of that trash can. She had a liver and a spleen half the size she should have. She was less than 5% of the weight of a normal, thriving 10-year-old. She was emaciated, she was skin, and she was bones. And this defendant starved her to death. Her brain was normal size. Why? Because it was doing everything it could to try to help her survive. It was doing everything it could to keep that child alive. And unfortunately, that meant she knew what was happening to her. Because you think about it and you heard about what Dr. Stauffenberg told you about the phases of starvation and how in the beginning you will be hunger and you will feel that pain and you will want for that food and you will search for it, maybe pulling the pot of leftovers off that she never got to eat. You will look for that food and you will feel that pain and it will hurt, and then the fatigue will set in and you will be able barely to walk and you will be slow, and the mental anguish comes in, the mental part where you can't think and you want that food, that pain and that hurt and that suffering. Day after day after day. And on top of it, that child was burned and no medical attention was sought. Not one bit of medical attention.
Next, the prosecutor told the jury why the state believes this defendant decided to harm her stepdaughter. The state said it was flat-out hatred.
Imani represented to her everything she hated. She cost her her job. She cost her her career. She was why she went to jail. It was why she was on probation. It was Imani's fault. She was beaten because she didn't do her homework fast enough. This defendant lived with the person in the next room who she despised, who she did not want, who she wanted to be rid of. To this defendant, every single day, that child represented that to her. She was that. Imani was nothing. She was a nuisance. She was ugly. She was nothing. She was a pain. She was disposable. She was trash. She was trash.
This state's key witness was the victim's father, the defendant's own husband. That man, Iman Moss, said he noticed belt whips on his daughter after the defendant punished her. State intervention helped for a while, but it did not save the girl's life. According to the father, the defendant said victim Imani Moss died because of a cooking accident.
Say she was cooking something with the pot and she spilled the water on her stomach.
That Imani was cooking?
Imani, yeah. Tiffany said Imani was cooking.
And that she spilled a pot.
Yeah.
Did Tiffany tell you what was in the pot?
No, said hot water.
So when you went home, did you look at your daughter and
Yeah.
what did you see?
She had a skull on the stomach, like a round little skull part on the stomach.
And
And on her,
did you say we ought to take her to the doctor?
yeah, but I didn't do it.
So on the 24th, you found her in the bathtub, and did it look to you like Imani was having a seizure?
Best of my knowledge, yes.
I know you're not a doctor,
Yeah.
but what did she look like?
She was shaking, like, you know.
Could she speak?
She was trying to say something. She wasn't speaking much. She was, you know.
Were her eyes moving at all?
They were going from left to right.
So after Tiffany said we can't call the doctor, we can't take her to the hospital, what'd you do with her?
Kept her in the room,
In which room?
in her room.
I mean, did you put her on the floor, or where did you put her?
On a mattress, and on the floor.
Amon, did she ever get up out of that bed?
No, she didn't after the seizure thing. No, she didn't.
The father admitted he drove around with his dead daughter's body in his car. Also in the car, his wife, this defendant, and 2 other kids. He said the defendant wanted to bury Imani's body, but that it was his idea to burn it.
I lifted the trash can out. I opened the bag of charcoal and poured it in the tin can.
In the garbage?
The trash can, the tin can. And from that point, she helped me open the bag up where, you know, Imani's body, you know, wrapped up in duct tape. She helped me put her body in the tin can.
Did you put her head up or head down?
Head up.
Did you have to force her into it?
Kinda, yeah.
After you put Imani in that garbage can, what did you do then?
I sprinkled some lighter fluid on the body and on charcoal.
Then what?
And then I took the charcoal and I lighted on fire and I dropped it in the tin can.
So did it start to burn?
It started to flame real big.
And so what were you doing at that point?
I was standing out, and I was standing. She was out there with me.
I mean, did y'all say anything, or would you just stand and watch the fire?
As I did it, I couldn't. I really didn't. I turned back. I didn't watch it, and she said, "I can't watch this," and it just burning.
How long did you let it burn?
Not that long. I want to say I let it burn for about maybe 5 minutes, and I put it out.
Why?
Because it wasn't working in the way I thought it was supposed to work.
And what did you think was going to happen?
I know it sounds ridiculous, I'm thinking it's like cremation. I don't know anything about that.
Okay, the father pleaded guilty and is serving a life sentence over his daughter's death and his involvement. We just heard him talk about that. And though the father testified about the victim's injuries, the medical examiner said it was the starvation which killed Tiffany Moss.
She was extremely thin and emaciated. She had a starved look, and based on her weight and the loss of muscle mass and the fact that her organs were so small compared to the normal charts, I was able to conclude from that she had died from starvation.
You ruled this starvation. In your opinion, do you know and can you describe for the jury kind of the order or what would happen when somebody is being starved?
Well, the first thing that would happen in the early stages, they would experience hunger pangs. She would probably feel hungry. She would be asking for food, looking for food, craving food. Following that, the next step would be apathy, fatigue, not able to do her usual activities. And from there, she would become more and more listless, eventually lethargic, and mental status changes. She would not feel like moving around much. She wouldn't have much energy. There would be extreme weight loss that would be visible. And then finally, death.
This is a death penalty case, and it now moves into its penalty phase. The two attorneys who sat standby during the original phase asked to step in and represent Tiffany Moss during this next phase. Here they cited old cases to get the judge to see the broader issues, but the prosecutor, who you also hear here, was not having it.
Even though the defendant wanted death, the trial judge was in a position to decide whether that was a just punishment. And that's what we're saying in this case.
So I have to investigate mitigating evidence for her?
You have to consider it. Under Morrison versus the state, again, it said it opens up. It's not just whether the state wants to kill the defendant and the defendant wants to die. It's whether that is the just punishment.
The defendant in this case has not requested counsel. I can't speak for what happened at an ex parte or a private meeting yesterday, but inferring from the court's statement that nothing was going to change, I can only assume that, number one, she has not requested counsel to come in. Number two, the court has observed and the state has observed that in her own way, she is participating in these proceedings. She won 2 jury challenges. She questioned jurors. She has examined every document that I personally have handed to her. She has asked questions. She has made her choice about whether or not to object to those documents. She has gone through the evidence with both myself and Ms. Jones, and in fact noticed that one of the exhibits, exhibit number 14, the small Bic lighter, was not in one of the boxes, and so they had to search for it. I can think of a rational defense where a defendant in a death penalty case might choose to represent themselves and might choose to remain mute, because all she needs to do is sway one juror. I have to convince all 12 jurors that death is the appropriate punishment. But all she has to do is convince one. And then if the jury hangs, by operation of law, the court will be forced into one sentence or another less than death. I can see where in the mind of a juror, a passive, overpowered, outgunned defendant, there might be a thought in that juror's mind that it's just not fair to put her to death.
Joining me tonight are attorneys Katie Tchaikovsky and Michael Bryant. So Katie, the judge said no standby counsel. They can't come into this phase because basically that's what the client wants, is no standby counsel. But is that a good ruling, giving these sort of underlying mental issues that might be here, or is this going to be Exhibit A on appeal?
Really interesting legal question. I think that the prosecutor made a really good point that this seems to be a very strategic decision on the part of Tiffany Moss. And the judge said that she doesn't want counsel. I can't force her to do that under some theory of a public interest in the justice system, because that's not necessarily what the Constitution requires. So she's made this decision. She's not incompetent to stand trial as far as we know. She's not been determined to be, and she's proceeding with it. And I think the judge, it will get reviewed very strictly on appeal, but I don't know that it's an automatic overturning.
Not a clear-cut win. Certainly, Michael, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's going to be so many appellate issues in this thing. It's going to be huge. Whether this one carries the day or not, I don't know. I think he's on solid ground here. I think that the case law suggests if you're able to represent yourself through the penalty phase or through the guilt phase, then the penalty phase should be handled the same way. I think he's all right.
And the law is different in different states as well, okay? In some states, they require multiple attorneys there in order to even bring a death penalty. Georgia's different. If that's the law of Georgia, then he's going to follow it. Katie, let's talk about the advocacy here, though. I thought the prosecution was incredibly strong in this case. They had a strong case, but the degree of the advocacy, the way that the prosecutor was asking questions was great. The way that the closing argument went was very, very skilled as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think they really laid out the facts, and the facts in this case in a lot of ways speak for themselves, but it's not a direct murder case in a lot of senses, because it's this prolonged issue with the starvation and the prolonged course of action on the part of the defendant. So they had to be very careful to show the deliberateness of that action versus a neglect, and I think they did a very nice job with that.
I agree as well. We'll be back with you and Michael at the end of the broadcast here, because still ahead tonight on The Debrief, the case of a California woman stabbed on the night she was said to be expecting a celebrity date, and the suspected serial killer is about to go on trial. Plus, those recordings from the prostitution case involving New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft are once again the subject of arguments in court. We'll discuss that after the break. We are preparing to cover the trial of a man accused of killing the reported date of actor Ashton Kutcher. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was found stabbed to death in her Hollywood apartment on February 22, 2001. Her childhood friend, Carolyn Murnick, wrote a book about their time together. It's called The Hot One. Police suspect an alleged serial killer named Michael Gargiulo. He's the one going on trial this week. The victim's friend, however, downplayed the connection between Kutcher and the victim this morning on Law and Crime. Here is that friend's discussion with my colleague, Jesse Weber.
She wasn't his girlfriend, and from my research and talking to her friends, he was someone that hung out in their social circles, and the night of her murder was going to be the first time that they were spending time together one-on-one. And so he came to pick her up for this agreed-upon date. They were going to go to some post-Grammys party and found that she didn't answer the door, and then exactly what you said, looked in the window and saw what he thought was wine on the carpet. It's such a strange thing to put your head into now. The more and more as I've learned about, how their life was and how they had different people stopping by, people you don't necessarily, you hang out with a lot of different people when you're in your early 20s, and I think that potentially they were a loose connection, and he didn't really necessarily think anything was that odd, that he showed up at someone's house, she wasn't there, oh, maybe we got the plans wrong.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think anything more than that.
I want to focus, though, on Michael Gargiulo. Mm-hmm. Did you know this name? I mean, when you heard about what happened to Ashley, you did your own bit of investigation. Did he come up as one of the people you were looking at?
No, in fact, I knew nothing about him until I got to the preliminary hearing, which was in 2010 now. And so, I heard that he was the person arrested and connected to these 3 other murders in 2008, which is when I started to look into things. And I had no idea who he was. I had no idea if he was known to her. And it wasn't until 2010 at the preliminary hearing that I learned, yes, he was someone that they knew socially and had been in her life for at least a few months before the murder.
Statements in that case are expected here on the Law and Crime Network on Thursday. Testimony, meanwhile, has resumed in the drawn-out case of the McStay family murders in California. Defendant Charles Merritt is accused of killing business associate Joseph McStay and the entire McStay family. They all disappeared back in 2010. Several years later, the graves of all 4 of the McStays turned up in the Mojave Desert. Today, an accountant hired by the defense went over ledgers involving money which moved back and forth between the defendant and the victims. Undercover recordings captured by secret cameras inside a Florida massage parlor were once again the subject of courtroom discussions today. They all surround the case made famous because New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft was caught up in the police sting. Attorneys for various defendants are arguing that the recordings, which allege to show sexual acts, should be kept private. Local news organizations in Florida want those recordings released pursuant to state open records law. Earlier in this case, Kraft's own attorneys asked that the videos be suppressed as evidence in court on grounds that they were unconstitutionally obtained. Attorneys Katie Cherkosky and Michael Bryan are back once more here on the Debrief tonight. So, Michael, today's argument was from local defendants, not Kraft's attorneys, but the judge said, look, Kraft's attorneys already blocked these recordings from being released prior to trial. So in this case involving other defendants, we might as well block them as well because that seems logical.
Of course. I mean, that actually does make sense. And, you know, there's so much intertwined activity between these various cases. You can't really parse it out and come out with some version of the video that should be released because it doesn't affect the other case. It affects everything.
I mean, yeah, everything's rolled up together here. You've got defendants, you've got this prostitution sting, you've got accusations, you've got people pleading not guilty, and you've got people saying, Katie, I'm on these recordings and I did nothing absolutely wrong, so I don't want these things released. I was just there getting a legitimate massage. Nothing funny was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the judges made the right call. There's not any public interest that's served in releasing these pre-trial, especially when there are litigated cases that are pending. And the details of the recordings have already been released. So what is the purpose of showing the actual footage besides just having a salacious story?
Well, you know, sometimes the press wants access to things. They want to look and see if the conduct described is really what the prosecutor claims happened. And sometimes reporters just ask for these things to make sure that the open records law remains robust. But look, I'm a reporter. I'm also an attorney. I don't want to see these things ahead of this trial, though, because when you've got a collision of First Amendment rights, which affect the press, and a collision of a right to a fair trial, which affects defendants, I've come down on the side of, okay, look, let the defendants have their shot without these things being made public. Michael, I think you agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And let's face it, it's going to be tough enough to get a jury in the first case, let alone having that video out there to further taint the pool. It's just not a good thing.
It's going to be one to watch for sure, and one that could go off the rails easily. Katie Cherkosky, Michael Bryan, appreciate your time together with me here on the Debrief today.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot for those of you watching. Of course, you can join us again tomorrow at 5 o'clock Eastern, right here on the Law&Crime Network for our daily recap of moments in criminal cases nationwide. Our live trial coverage, however, begins at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. That's Eastern Standard Time. Have a good night, everybody.